the first Naked Gun film is regarded as a classic. The second Naked Gun film, Naked Gun 2.5, The Smell of Fear, was that 192 million box office off a 23 million budget. The third Naked Gun film was sort of the forgotten about one, isn't it? So it's also the one where it's hardest to dig into the story. But I've had a go. Let's see how we go. For Paramount Pictures, at the very least, it must have been a really easy decision to get a third Naked Gun film off the ground. They're relatively cheap to make. They made a lot of money. And for those of us who followed the story of Frank Drebin back from the days of Police Squad as well, we were going to turn up. But also Naked Gun had crossed over. The first film in particular helped. It's when the second film came out, I think, in 91. And I think the second film is notably weaker than the first. But it was a big summer release, and in a difficult summer for Hollywood, the Naked Gun 2.5, The Smell of Fear, was outperforming, certainly in terms of profit, the more expensive stuff, the Hudson Hawks, the Backdrafts, and films of that ilk. So, Naked Gun 33 1/3, The Final Insult then, directed by Peter Segal, coming to him, written by Pat Proft, David Zucker, Robert LaCache, based on Police Squad, which was created by Zaz, Jim Abrahams, who we've recently lost, David Zucker, Jerry Zucker, and stars Leslie Nielsen, Priscilla Presley, George Kennedy, O.J. Simpson, Fred Ward, and Nicole Smith as well. And so, it wasn't too long after the release of The Smell of Fear that I remember reading in film magazines about Paramount wants to get this new one going, that it was going to be called Naked Gun 33 1/3, For the Record. Now, that's an old vinyl joke, although now vinyl's come back in. I suspect more people probably get it. But there was a feeling over time that over the development of the film, people wouldn't necessarily get that. I might come back to that in a second. For David Zucker, he had directed the first two films. They were his first solo directorial outings, really, that he co-directed with Jim Abrahams and Jerry Zucker, the likes of Airplane, of course, the peerless Top Secret. I adore Top Secret. They've done, was it Ruthless People as well, where they just tried to stretch themselves away from spoof comedy. But each of them took on individual films as solo directors. So Jerry Zucker notably with Ghost, Jim Abrahams with the Hot Shots films, though he did a bunch of other stuff as well before stepping back from movie making for family reasons. And then Zucker stuck with spoofs, and in fact fairly relentlessly since he stuck with spoof movies. The Naked Gun proved to be a stellar success, did enormous money on video. But the process of making them was quite arduous for him. So for David Zucker, you could read David Fincher, that Zucker would do 20, 30 takes just to get the right shot, just to make sure that the joke landed. And it was a fairly arduous collection of films to shoot. As funny as the Naked Gun movies are, the making of them significantly less so. I say that from the outside looking in. I wasn't on the set of those, but it was take after take after take after take after take. And Zucker didn't want to direct another one. He was going to stay involved with it, but these weren't easy films to make. And he'd done two of them, and he'd a box office hit and an acclaimed comedy favourite. But he was obviously going to be overseeing and involved with whatever the third film was going to be. Leslie Nielsen definitely coming back. Priscilla Presley definitely coming back as well. And so it was Pat Proft, Robert LaCache, and David Zucker who put this script together. Pat Proft worked on the Hot Shots films as well, with Jim Abrahams, and himself a legendary comedy writer, not least of spoof films. Robert K. Weiss would be producing again. And what they were able to do with the third film was, instantly they were going to get more money to make it than they'd had on any of the previous two. The Police Squad TV series was not the most well-resourced in terms of budget. And likewise, the first and second Naked Gun films were on the modest side as well. By the time we're getting to Naked Gun 33 1/3, $30 million budget. Was the quoted number. To give that some kind of context, that's $7 million up on the film beforehand. And so they were able to kind of expand their scope a little bit and try things that they'd wanted to put in previous films and not put them in. There's a sequence in the third Naked Gun film, for instance, where we get the wedding of Jane and Frank. And that was originally something that was for a different Naked Gun. In fact, I think bits of it was shot, but they were unable to work it in that case. However, the significant part of this was an opening sequence that spoofs, if you go right the way back in cinema history, Sergei Eisenstein's The Battleship Potemkin, but then more memorably in pop culture, Brian De Palma's The Untouchables. And that was the kind of thing that they didn't have the money to do first time round. Well, now they had a bit more cash, and so they were able to basically put together some of the ideas that they weren't able to do in the first place. They're going to shoot it in 1993, so there'd been a little bit of breathing room as well. But they needed a new director as well. And that's where Peter Segal came in. And he's given a podcast interview fairly recently about his experience. Is it Rich Eisen, I think he saw? And not. So we'll come to the detail of it because it sounds like he didn't have the best of times. But he was brought in by David Zucker and was given the job. I think he was 30 and when he was taking this on. Leslie Nielsen, by this point in his late 60s, I believe. And so, I mean, there was a veteran of cinema on the one hand. Leslie Nielsen, of course, before he got to spoof cinema, films like The Poseidon Adventure, Forbidden Planet, a very, very highly regarded dramatic actor, and to a degree, some degree of cinema royalty, who'd now become the face of modern spoof comedy. And on the flip side of it, a director who's basically just getting his first break at this point. He'd done a lot of television stuff. He directed a couple of episodes and he'd done TV movie work as well. But this was clearly a big break for him to get the third Naked Gun film. So we head to the set towards the end of 1993. Shooting in Los Angeles. And Segal has been very, very open now about the fact that he didn't have the best of times working with Leslie Nielsen. And I've read one or two ways that this was reported online, and people are very defensive of Leslie Nielsen, and they're not necessarily taking Peter Segal's time aside on it. It's the Inside of You podcast he did a big interview with. But he talked on there, being on the set of this Naked Gun film, that I took a lot of grief, he said, from Leslie Nielsen, who didn't respect me. Now, Nielsen's not here to put his side of the argument, but I have dug out something from interviews he gave at the time, so I will try and put the other side of this. But the day one of shooting the third Naked Gun film was one that Peter Segal talked about, in his words, quote, one of the worst days of his life. Because he was directing a particular sequence, and he described how he was surprised at how slow the scene reading was going, that there wasn't the pace and the energy that he'd noticed from watching the earlier Naked Gun films. And David Zucker was on set on that day, and I get the impression he was quite a hands-on producer. And he went over to Zucker and said something along the lines of, I get it, you've basically helped build his performance here. And these stories of the 20-30 takes and just the way that the films were edited, I think kind of came to the fore a little bit. And what happened was Peter Segal kept going to Leslie Nielsen and asked him to pick up the pace. And he described it as, quote, it took several pulls of the cord. And Nielsen didn't take this particularly well, as per the story that Peter Segal told. He just lashed out at me and said to the crew, the kid wants me to go faster, he said. And Segal talked about how he found this, in his words, quote, humiliating. He had 72 shooting days planned for the Naked Gun 33 and a third, and this was day one, on the day one of directing a cinema feature film. And he just his heart sank that he's looking forward to another 71 days of this, and not looking forward to it with a great big grin on his face, I'd suggest. And so he pulled Nielsen aside and asked him to cut him some slack. And over time, over the course of the shoot, which I'll come to in a second, some slack was granted and they found a way through. But when he gave this interview, something kind of clicked in my head. And I went back to an interview that Peter Segal had given in 2005. And this was around the time he was directing The Longest Yard with Adam Sandler, the remake of Mean Machine and The Longest Yard. And he was asked at that point in a BBC interview, who's the biggest pain in the, what's the word, bottom you've ever worked with? And he was quite tactful with his answer. And he said, oh gosh, I don't know if I want to answer this. He said, there's an older gentleman that I've worked with, but I don't want to resort to his level. This actor criticised me for being young and impatient and coming from a television background that was all about speed, faster, funnier. Then, when he saw the movie at a premiere, he said, he had a guilty look on his face, and I didn't know why until the article came out a week later. So when I saw it, and it's the article where he criticised him. When I saw it, I called and said, why did you slam me in the movie before you'd even seen it? And he apologised, but he said he was such a pain in the ass on set. I didn't want to resort to his level, but he knows who I'm talking about and he's an asshole. So what's not definite is that he's addressing Leslie Nielsen there. It's just there's a little bit of greyness. There's a little bit of overlap, really. And the fact that it's only in recent times he's named a name. And to my knowledge, I've gone back through other interviews, he didn't name another name. It just feels a little bit coincidental. However, on the flip side of it, Nielsen too. I read stories of, I don't know, Jack Palance on City Slickers working with Billy Crystal. And Jack Palance, very storied actor. Shane is an amazing film. The late Jack Palance, it's the role that won him an Oscar. And on the first day, Billy Crystal described him as, it's quite tricky, but then realised that even though he's this acclaimed actor, he was just as insecure as anyone on the first day of a shoot. And it's not for me to put words in people's mouths. I just wonder if Peter Segal's account is straight down the line correct. If there's a little bit of that, I don't know. But there's this assumption that because people have had massive success, that they're all comfortable and confident with it. And I'm not sure that's always the case. Peter Segal's day one, in fact, got worse, because at the end of shooting, he then had to rush to hospital because his daughter was taken to the emergency room and she was just 4 years old, I think, at that. But it turned out she was okay, but that was his lowest day. And it was 2 weeks later that Nielsen said he'd taken a call from Sherry Lansing, then the head of Paramount, and Lansing was saying she'd loved the cut footage. And Nielsen said to Peter Segal, you're doing a Herculean job, and was complimentary, and they found their way through. And Nielsen had his confidence, and they found a way through to get the film shot. Now, one person who wasn't having the best of times as well was George Kennedy, who had been in all of the films to date. But he, and again, another storied actor. I love that where they got all their cast from for these movies. But he was ill with pneumonia, and a lot of his scenes in the film, if you go back and watch it, he sat down. It's just primarily because he was struggling to stand. He was very, very unwell, and they had to work around it. The production shot in Los Angeles, and it went to the Park Plaza Hotel, actually, in the city, for the Staircase train station Untouchables Battleship Potemkin spoof, which had, again, this sequence that had been talked about for the first movie, and it was a location that they'd also used for something else in the first movie. Not a train station, they just dressed it as such. They put a newsstand in there, and the magic of the movies, right? The big finale in Naked Gun 33 1/3. It shares this with 1992's The Bodyguard. It's the Academy Awards sequence. And I think the third Naked Gun film is quite patchy, but it's built. There's a couple of notable sequences in it that really spark, and the Academy Awards thing is an awful lot of fun. Now, the Academy Awards at this point were held at the Los Angeles Shrine, I think it was. Certainly, that's where it was when Titanic won its Oscar, for instance, and they were able to use the same venue that the actual Oscars were held in, like 6,000 plus seats, and so a fair few extras were going to be required. They were also going to use the opportunity to skewer the Oscars a little bit, and they spoofed people like Sally Field and Richard Gere and speeches they'd made from the Oscars stage. They brought in for the edit as well stock footage from previous Oscars just to flesh it all out. And there was the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences, AMPAS, the people who run the Oscars in the US, tend to be very, very protective of their gongs. And so, God, this is going niche. Here in the UK, as a TV series, it's not British television's finest hour, called Noel's House Party, that used to run. And in the early series of Noel's House Party, they had a thing called Gotcha Oscars, which was a kind of candid camera thing. Get someone famous doing something silly, and they get presented with a Gotcha Oscar. Well, this didn't go down well with AMPAS, and AMPAS got in touch with the BBC. And so Gotcha Oscars were called Gotchas from that point on. This presented a problem when the BBC was trying to package video cassettes of the best of the Gotcha Oscars, which were one of the most popular sequences of Noel's House Party. Noel's House Party, if you're unfamiliar, gave us Mr. Blobby. If you've not heard of Mr. Blobby, look him up. There's not much I can add there. That just looking at the picture would probably give you an idea. And so when they put the VHS tapes of Noel's House Party out, the Oscars are obscured because I think it was a hand grabbing an Oscar statuette, and you're not allowed to use the look of the Oscar statuette, which brings me back. It's a long way round to this Naked Gun story. That was one of the provisos. You could not call them Oscars if you're going to spoof them, and you cannot show the statue. You will not see actual Oscar awards in Naked Gun. The other big sequence as well was a prison riot. I mean, Fred Ward is in the midst of that as well, the late, much-missed Fred Ward. Again, lots of extras needed for this. This is where they could really scale the film up. And so they brought in real biker gangs, actually, from the Los Angeles area. And the story goes, I don't know, I've only got this from one source. It just entertained me, but I should, flag. I don't know if this is true or not, but it sounds fun. That they got... They inadvertently ended up with rival biker gangs in the same scene. They're just like real life people who didn't particularly get on. But that part of the shoot went okay. Nielsen as well. Let's go back. I mean, in terms of the shoot side of it, let's go back to Leslie Nielsen. Again, much missed. And he talked about, in promo videos, that he felt when he was shooting it was better than the first two of the films. And he was also defensive of Peter Segal in the junket interviews that I saw. He described how Segal was a young director with a committee telling him what to do and having to hold his own. Who that committee was, I mean, it might have been Paramount, it might have been David Zucker overseeing his production, but that notwithstanding, by early 1994, Naked Gun 33 1/3 was in the can, and it was now called The Final Insult because people didn't think they were going to get the record joke. And it was the turnaround in terms of edit wasn't particularly long. The film was scheduled for release in cinemas March the 18th, 1994. Now, it came at a difficult time for Paramount, though. It's worth contextualising this, that at the back end of 1993, Paramount's comedy sequels had unexpectedly stumbled. And so there were two films in particular both of the initial films were really popular. The sequels, to a degree, in both cases, were arguably better than their forerunners, but the box office performance notably down. So I'm talking about Wayne's World 2 and Addams Family Values. I mean, Addams Family Values in particular is much loved now, but I remember going to see it when it came out and being shocked at how badly, relatively, it did at the box office. And there was a feeling that comedy sequels had their day, that they were out of trend at that point. And here's Paramount coming along with a third in 6-7 months in the case of a third Naked Gun film. How is that going to do? I remember Entertainment Weekly ran a preview, and in fact, I read in that preview, even in light of disappointing results for some recent sequels, the new Gun should score a bullseye with the teen and college crowd rivaling its predecessor's hefty box office take. There was a little bit of problem ahead of the movie's release, and it comes down to a photo taken by a photographer called Annie Leibovitz. Now, she took a very famous photo of for a Vanity Fair front cover of Demi Moore. Demi Moore was heavily pregnant at the time. She was not wearing clothes in this particular photo, and the image went around the world. It became a sensation. Naked Gun decided to do a spoof of this with Leslie Nielsen taking the Demi Moore spot in their particular interpretation of that. Well, Annie Leibovitz was not happy with this at all, and legal action would ensue. Now, it was unsuccessful legal action, but it was another hurdle that Paramount had to get over just ahead of the release of the film. The movie goes before critics. I mean, there's barely any point going before critics with, by the time you're at Naked Gun 3, I'd suggest it's like putting out, I don't know, a Police Academy 4, putting that in front of critics. By that point, if you're not into it, you're not into it. However, the reviews were relatively mixed, and my memory of it, my memory of the second film as well, was I remember some of these jokes in Police Squad, and I really liked them in Police Squad, that it's a fair way down from the first film. However, the thing with Naked Gun 33 and a third is certain sequences were really credited with, were really given a lot of credit. The Academy Awards sequence in particular, also the prison riot. Anna Nicole Smith was, I've not mentioned her much because, I mean, a lot has been written, and in fact a documentary has been made about her life and just the amount of punching down she had to take. She didn't get great critical notices here. O.J. Simpson, another person, I mean, didn't get great critical notices, returning for a third and obviously final time in a Naked Gun film. I'm coming back to him shortly too. But there was a feeling that it would do, I think, with some sparky moments, but on the whole, it would do. However, going before audiences, I mean, we weren't talking the level of the second film, but Naked Gun 33 and a third still found its path to comfortable profit. That weekend that it opened, March the 18th to the 20th, 1994 in the US, top spot, $13.2 million, perfectly solid return for a comedy sequel, had outperformed Wayne's Worlds and Addams Family Values, had knocked Guarding Tess off the top of the chart. That was the number one the week before. It was number one by a lot, 13 million to 5 million in second place. The other opener it was up against, anyone remember Monkey Trouble, the family movie Monkey Trouble? That opened in third place with 4.5 million. There was quite a lot of Oscar stuff still around. Schindler's List was in fourth. Lightning Jack wasn't an Oscar film. That was in fifth. Ace Ventura and Pet Detective in sixth. The Ref from the late Ted Demme was in seventh. That's a really good film. A really good film. I do recommend checking that out. Mrs. Doubtfire in 8, Greedy down in 9, 8 Seconds down in 10. Thinking about it, there's one Oscar film, isn't there? The following week, well, I mean, the number was down by 39%, which, I mean, pretty much expected, not awful, but the mighty comedy sequel knocked it off the top of the charts. D2, The Mighty Ducks with 10.3 million. Also, Universal had significantly expanded The Paper from Ron Howard, starring Michael Keaton, if memory serves, Glenn Close and Michael Keaton. That was now up to third after a very limited release the week before. Schindler's List, Above the Rim, Guarding Tess. Philadelphia had had an Oscar bump. That moved up to 8th place. And then, this is the weird thing, right? The film that knocked the Mighty Ducks sequel off the top of the chart, which in turn had knocked the Naked Gun sequel off the top of the chart, was a comedy sequel, Major League 2 from Warner Brothers, 7 million, the worst performer of these new comedy sequels. Clifford and Thumbelina also opened that week. The Naked Gun was kind of holding its own, and disappointingly, there was no comedy sequel opening the week after. There was an underrated movie by the name of Threesome, though, which is worth digging out, from Andrew Fleming, that is. I'm quite a fan of that. And so by the time the Naked Gun finishes its US run, $51 million at the US box office, notably down on the box office of the first film, the second film, which had done, 87 million. But again, it brought in the audience overseas, another 80 million or so overseas. The full box office returns for Naked Gun 33 and a third, the final insult, 132 million off a 30 million budget, and Paramount perfectly happy with that. Now, that appeared to be that the idea of doing more Naked Gun films had come to an end. Peter Segal would quickly go on to make Tommy Boy with Chris Farley the year after, which I would suggest is a more regarded film. And I mean, he talked about when he was prepping Tommy Boy, he met Nielsen again, and Nielsen had forgotten his name, and he described that as a quite a tough experience. However, Nielsen by this point in his late 60s as well. So, you know, I'm an outsider of this. I just report what people are saying, and it's quite hard to actually have a say on that when one person isn't around. There was talk of a fourth Naked Gun film from the same team for a little while, with Leslie Nielsen involved. Now, O.J. Simpson, by this point, was not going to be involved, and it was said that was one of the factors that stopped a Naked Gun 4 happening. But also, there'd been talk about this was supposed to be a trilogy. You know, once they realised they were going to do a second film, a trilogy seemed logical. However, by the time we get to the early 2000s, the DVD boom, Naked Gun films are selling again. And before Nielsen passed, there was talk and there was a script written for another Naked Gun that would have brought Pat Proft and David Zucker and Leslie Nielsen back in. Proft and Zucker, though, were recruited to the Scary Movie franchise for a few films. They took Nielsen with them as well. And those were getting off the ground. A new Naked Gun wasn't. Now, I interviewed Leslie Nielsen in 2008 and I asked him about a new film, and he said at that point, there has been some talk from time to time, but there's no immediate plan. But never say never unless someone asks, would you like to be slapped in the face with a cold flounder? As I sit here in 2025, there is now a new Naked Gun film. Leslie Nielsen has sadly passed, leaving behind such a joyful collection of work. We lost him in 2010. It's 15 years after he's lost. It's Liam Neeson who's stepping into the role of Frank Drebin, or in this case, Frank Drebin Jr. Akiva Schaffer of Pop Star Never Stop Never Stopping is directing. David Zucker has been very, very vocal about not being a fan of the direction that the new Naked Gun is going. But also, I mean, you look at the three that they put out, and if they wanted a trilogy, they got a trilogy. I would suggest it's a trilogy of, I don't know, diminishing returns to a degree. But I do think, even though the comedy has clearly aged, and it's clearly aged, not least referencing movies that were very contextual to the time and not in particularly nice ways, there's still joyful moments in that film. And the scale of it is really, really quite interesting. Naked Gun 4 script, I would imagine, is out there somewhere. I think personally, feel free to disagree. They're probably right to knock it on the head with this particular team when they did.